You commanded my presence, your grace.
Over the years, Square Enix has tried to reinvent the wheel when it comes to Final Fantasy. From turn-based RPGs, action games, or a mix in between, they're one of the few devs unafraid to mix up the formula of such a long-standing series. Now, whether that's good or bad is debatable, but what I always care about first and foremost is if the game they have created is an experience worth my time. And Final Fantasy XVI has definitely been worth my time, at least for the most part. On a foundational level, Final Fantasy XVI doesn't do anything wrong. It's a well-made game from the mechanics to production, and it's easily in my top 3 games I've played so far this year. But with that said, I can't help but feel like there was another level that could have been taken with the game that could have pushed it towards the greatest game of all time discussion, starting with the combat.
What's in there?
Bloody hell! Horrible.
So the basics of the combat is pretty simple at the start of the game. You have your basic sword combo when on the ground or in the air that you can do along with being able to shoot magic. You can dodge enemy attacks with the ability to counter if you dodge at the last second, or you can even parry enemy attacks by timing your attack at the last second to clash with theirs, which I thought was a cool way to handle parries. Then from there, the combat expands greatly as you get new abilities from the icon users you meet throughout the story as the main protagonist Clive, which we'll get into later on. But the way this works is each icon has a core ability you can equip, and you can equip up to 3 of them. These are abilities like the Phoenix Shift that swiftly dashes you close to enemies, to Odin's Arm of Darkness that allows you to summon his blade to use. Then with each of those 3 main abilities you have equipped, you can equip an additional 2 extra abilities to each of the bars that you cycle through from any of the icons. I really liked this setup since it allowed for me to experiment with different combos to see how I could optimize my damage for combat and how I could basically make one ability flow to the next. Then the icon skill trees allow for upgrades for these abilities that increase their effectiveness or adds new attacks to your basic combos, like a downward sword plunge attack. You have a limit break bar that fills up from combat that can be activated that supercharges your combat abilities for a short time while also healing you. Enemies have stagger bars that you can drain to stop them in their tracks, to temporarily stun them, or do bonus damage, which all of this is makings of a great combat system. Unfortunately, that is about as deep as the well goes for basic combat, because as good as the combat feels, and let me make this perfectly clear, the combat feels really good. It can feel incredibly shallow at times compared to a traditional Final Fantasy game. For example, it feels like a massive missed opportunity to not have elements matter in this game. Like, where are the status ailments you come to expect from a Final Fantasy game? These could have elevated the combat to another level and made it one of the best action games ever. If I use fire against fire enemies, it should heal them. If I use fire against plants, it should do double damage. Why can't I be poisoned, paralyzed, burn? Adding these changes could have made each area you explore in the game way more interesting. It would have made you think about what items, accessories, or weapons you should bring to counter what you might face. So instead of just equipping the best weapon you have with a bunch of potions to heal or tonics to buff you, you might think to yourself, yeah, this weapon might have the highest damage, but my water blade will do bonus damage against the fire type enemies that overrun this area. So I'll take the small damage drop against normal enemies to do the bonus damage against fire enemies. Or instead of bringing this many potions, I'm going to focus on having this bottle of, let's say, holy water to protect me against the flames. This is where the game could have shined so much more. Even with your attributes that are so basic, leveling up could have been way more interesting. You just have strength, vitality, and will that raise each time you level up, which combos with your equipment to determine your overall attack, defense, and stagger ability. They could have added in elemental or status effect resistances as their own categories, then made it so each time you level up, you could allocate points to these different categories so you could choose how your character develops. If I wanted no health but big damage, I could do that, or vice versa. Then throughout the game you have party members that join you on your journey, with the only constant one being your dog Torgal, who's a very good boy by the way. But outside of some basic commands and a leveling type system that's almost superficial in nature based on how much you use said commands, there is no customization for the characters. You can't control them, they're just there fighting alongside of you, which is just disappointing. It would have at least been nice if you could choose who join you for battle during certain parts of the game. Like before the final boss when everyone is at your main hideout, it would have been cool if I could choose who I could bring with me while I finish up some side quests around the land. Then on top of all of that, even the enemy variety outside of the absolute stellar boss battles was disappointing. There just isn't much going on that's interesting. Once in a while you would get enemies that would heal, create barriers, have strong defenses, or raise the attack of their allies, but this is so few and far between, it might as well not even be there. If you're going to have enemies like this in the game, then throw them at me constantly to help keep the combat against basic enemies fresh. And just overall, it just would have been nice to see more enemy variety, because the second half of the game, or really the final third of the game, it could feel pretty stagnant with all of the reskin enemies that you face. But turning back to the boss battles, and this will be where I say from this point on, there will be massive spoilers, but the boss battles are beyond epic. There isn't a single boss battle I didn't like, no matter how small. From the Final Fantasy XIV-like mechanics, music, and fluidness of the bosses, I have no issue saying Final Fantasy XVI has from top to bottom the best boss battles in any game ever. Definitely when it comes to the main battles against your fellow icons. The oversized kaiju-like fights when Clive transforms into Ifrit are so much fun. And it's not just the spectacle that makes them great. The actual combat feels really good, which is something I was worried about them nailing, because whenever you get fights at this scale, it always seems to be a challenge for games to make them mechanically fun or not overly cinematic, where you don't really do anything as a character. But they nailed it. Definitely when you look at something like Titan's second phase, he's literally the size of a mountain. But you battle him through this amazing blend of cinematics and actual combat that feels so satisfying. Hell, even the fights against the icon users themselves are incredible. It's crazy how big the attack variety of these bosses are. It just adds to the overall epicness of these fights. When every other boss feels like they should be a final boss of a game, you're doing something right. Now, I wish I could say the same thing about the story and world.
Cheer up, you two. Can't think of a safer place in the Empire than a... brothel.
I feel very mixed about the story. It's very good, but at the same time, I can't help but think they got carried away with it. What I mean by this is the entire opening segment of the game feels like it's setting up the main character Clive to go out on a journey to get revenge for his father and brother Joshua, who both died thanks to a set of events that started because of Clive's mother, Annabella, betraying their kingdom. But years later, after she basically captures you, you find your childhood friend Jill, which leads to you getting saved by Sid, who takes the both of you in, which leads to this huge journey where Clive has to come face the fact that his brother's death was actually his fault, which ends up with you joining Sid on his quest to destroy these mother crystals that are bleeding the land dry of ether while nations are at war all around you? Which, this all sounds amazing. You could have had this massive journey destroying the crystals that eventually led to you facing your mother at the end to destroy the last crystal guarded by her kingdom. And her new son could have been the next person to inherit the Phoenix power, which would have been a great way to end the game. You started the game first icon fight playing as the Phoenix against Ifrit, and you could have ended it playing as Ifrit against the Phoenix. Instead, your brother isn't dead, so everything Clive went through emotionally was pretty much for nothing and pulled at your heartstrings for basically no reason. Ultima turns out to be the actual bad guy who's trying to turn your body into the perfect vessel for his power and all the icons' powers and the power of the world. It's so much more happens. It's crazy how this story turns a complete 180. Now, I will say this. Even with the Ultima reveal, I would say the story all the way up to Bahamut is really good still. But after that, the story gets a little messy and filled with missed opportunities. Like when you have to go out into the ocean to save Jill from Odin on mid-ship, he splits the sea and you fall to the bottom. And instead of fighting him there for a pointless battle where you just get your ass kicked anyways, it would have been sick if the missing Leviathan icon would have been there and interrupted the fight so Odin had to retreat, leaving Clive to battle against it, which then leads to the following events of like Clive and Joe being on the beach and so on. Just small changes like that would have made more sense to the story, but I still enjoyed it. I think Clive was a great protagonist. The supporting cast is wonderful, definitely when it comes to Gav and Sid, who are to me some of the best characters that they have ever written in any Final Fantasy game. The comedy they unleash was top notch and unique in their own way. I just wish we could have got them all hanging out together more throughout the story, definitely with how top notch the voice acting and animations were. Now shifting to the land you explore, it's a great looking world, but I can't help but feel it's missing some of that Final Fantasy charm. Like the key story areas where you're going to destroy the crystals look amazing and are as Final Fantasy as they get, definitely when it comes to the final boss arena against Ultima. But areas like the open fields or sandy deserts can almost feel like a different game, like something is just missing. Maybe if they had more iconic enemies from past games roaming it, it would feel more like Final Fantasy, like cactuars in the desert areas or tonberries in the fields, just something to spice up the areas. Definitely when you're off doing all the various monster hunts or various side quests the game has available to the player, which both I enjoyed greatly. The monster bounty board quests offer a variety of beefed up enemies for the player to challenge, to test their skills. As for the side quests, they are pretty boring in terms of tasks you perform in most of them, since they feel like fetch quests a lot of the time from MMOs, but the dialogue and world building for the characters, for me anyways, makes them worth doing. Not to mention you do get renowned for doing some of these, which earns you bonus items at your hideout, which, speaking of your hideout, there are a variety of things to check out here. I won't go into massive detail for everything, but here you can find side quests, see collectibles, look at the bounty board, buy or craft items, change music, and what I consider the best part of it all, access the Elite Stone, which here you can practice skills against enemies, play for high score in arcade mode, or replay stages from any point in the story. And there is an additional mode for those playing on the hardest difficulty, Final Fantasy. All of these paired with the new Game Plus definitely adds some good replayability to the game for those who want a little more after completing everything else the game has to offer. Now, to touch on a few last things, as good as the graphics and lighting in the world is, the performance was really rough at times. I'm not sure how far my frame rates would drop, but it didn't feel great. Now, I did play on performance mode because as much as I wanted to play on fidelity mode with the locked 30 FPS because I would take a consistent 30 FPS over a jumpy 60 FPS any day of the week, I just couldn't do it with how awful the motion blur is in the game. It's one of the worst I've seen. Now, they did acknowledge the motion blur and plan to update the game with the option to remove it, so that's huge to me, even though there is no, date or time for when that would happen. But the funniest thing did happen. After I got past the Titan fight in the game, I basically no longer had frame drops. I don't know how, I don't know why, but my frame drops went almost completely away. It was nice to say the least. Also, the active time lore that's available at any time that gives you info on the current events and area you're in is a very nice feature I wish more games had. But with all that said, Final Fantasy XVI feels so much like Breath of the Wild to me in the aspect that you have this incredible game that with a few more tweaks, it could be something even greater. So am I saying I'm hoping the next Final Fantasy game is an action RPG? Not necessarily. I believe there is a place for both turn-based and action-style Final Fantasy games in the future, which no matter what way Square Enix decides to go, I'll be looking forward to it, but for now, I could say Final Fantasy XVI is a very good game that isn't a waste of your time.